so you can play.
Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and it's time for another episode of Shadows in the Warp. Today's episodes, and by episodes I mean this one that's free and the other one that's in the vault with the link below, are going to address Synapse. This video we're going to talk about the lore of Synapse. We're going to talk about what it is, what's the Hive Mind, what is the Brood Mind, talking about the various creatures that exert their synaptic control on the other tyranids. And then in the second video, which is available in the vault at the link below, is going to talk about tactics and how you can build a list around Synapse and how you can properly choose how much you need and which creatures are better than others to take in order to exert your synaptic will, and what are ways that you can kind of get around it, what creatures can survive without it, and everything else that I've learned about building Tyranid lists, thinking about Synapse creatures all along, of course. So first the lore, and then the link below in the vault will be all about the tactics. So let's start. What is the Hive Mind? We talked a little bit about this in our last episodes of Shadows in the Warp, where we talked about the Hive Mind being a collective consciousness of billions, if not trillions, if not quadrillions, of Tyranid organisms. Now, in reality, we don't really know what the Hive Mind is. We have what, of course, the Games Workshop lore tells us in the Tyranid Codex and in other areas as well, but even they are a little elusive about what it is. They even give some possibilities. For example, is it the collective consciousness of trillions of Tyranid organisms, which I really hope is the case, or is it some one or group of super powerful psychers who are able to exert their will on billions and trillions and quadrillions of Tyranid organisms, which I really hope it isn't. However, when you look at the lore, you see that it can point either way. For example, if it is just the consciousness of billions of organisms, then why do we need Synapse creatures? Now, what a Synapse creature is it's a Tyranid creature that's been given more cranial capabilities, in other words, a little bit more independence or a little bit more independent will, but with the additional ability to project the Hive Mind's will on nearby creatures. This is necessary to control the really small organisms such as hormigons or ripper swarms, or even some of the beast-like ones, even carnifexes and trigons and molochs, the ones that don't naturally have a really strong link to the Hive Mind. See, this is where I look at it and think, I could see how it's either that they're all actually part of the consciousness, or really the consciousness is only the Synapse creatures, and that exerts its will over all these other smaller creatures, not necessarily smaller in terms of size, because we have carnifexes and tyrannifexes that, and even a lot of the ships that the Hive Fleet comes on, which are not necessarily Synapse creatures. So are those slaves to the Hive Mind, or do they actually all connectively make the Hive Mind, and the Synapse creatures just represent a node, kind of like how in our brain you'll have synapses kind of going around, but there's certain areas that they break off of, even though I don't know tons about brains. And the answer to that question is really not answered, and it's really up to Games Workshop if they decide that they ever want to develop that. I, for one, hope they never do, because I like it the way it is, kind of that mystery that's there, and I hope that they don't add in like one powerful psyker, like there's an old one who actually created the Tyranid race or something like that. That smacks too much of the Zerg from StarCraft, and I didn't like what they did with their lore. But I digress. Let's continue talking about Synapse creatures and the Hive Mind. So, really, when we look at this, what are the Synapse creatures? There's a lot that you have access to in the Tyranid Codex, and there's also some that are outside of that are more just talked about. Of course, we know of the mighty Hive Tyrants, the Hive Tyrants being probably the most powerful Synapse creatures that we have access to in the Tyranid Codex. In other words, that aren't like not the out-of-print model or seen in some other game. The Hive Tyrant is almost independent of the Hive Mind. It's able to develop its own tactics, it's able to develop its own strategies, and it's able to exert its will on nearby creatures. However, when I say almost independent, you really have to understand what that is for what it is. It might act independently, but really it's still completely subject to the will of the Hive Mind, whatever that might be. The Hive Tyrants, of course, are very powerful. They can be able to, they can fly if they need to, they can develop wings, they can develop biomorphs that allow them to shoot long-range artillery that can take down vehicles and infantry alike, or they can totally just be beast mode in close combat with all sorts of sighting talons and swords and lash whips, and just wade into combat doing tons and tons of damage. So they're very versatile, which of course we find most of the Tyranid race is, so that it can adapt to local conditions and figure out what it is it wants. Of course, there's even really notable Hive tyrants like the Swarm Lord, who fought I believe it was the Ultramarines that he was responsible for fighting. He developed just a super alien cunning to go after Marnius, I believe it was, for the Ultramarines. And so you see these local adaptations where you get kind of a named character. Well, it's not really named, it's more named by its food names. It's like, oh, let's call this one the Swarm Lord because it's a really strong and powerful Hive tyrant. So these ones represent really good Synapse creatures that are able to exert their will. We also have lesser creatures such as warriors and shrikes, which are basically the same creature. One is just with wings. And then the more advanced warrior, of course, which is the Trigon Prime, which you can recognize it different from the warriors as its head is a little bit bigger, which allows it to exert a stronger will and, of course, show off that it's one of the powerful creatures. Not that Tyranid individuals are actually individuals and care about all that kind of stuff, but that is what we see right there. Warriors, of course, are incredibly common, and so they form the backbone of the synaptic web in a Tyranid army because there's so many of them. Even though the Hive tyrants are more powerful individually, the warriors are much more numerous. And then you get the shrikes, which of course are basically winged warriors, which are able to carry that will forward to the vanguard organisms, along with flying Hive tyrants, of course, but then like once again the shrikes are in more numbers. And then we get the mysterious zoanthropes. Like, who knows where these things evolved from? Because they're basically a gigantic brain. And that's about it. There's a gigantic brain with like some claws and things hanging down. They literally don't have legs to walk on. They float about using psychic powers, and the zoanthropes are probably some of the most powerful psychers that the Tyranids have access to in their armies. And they float around and they project a warp field around them that stops pretty much anything. Even destroyer hits from huge cannons can be deflected by one of these warp fields as it projects around itself. And it can also take that power and manifest it and puncture armor or explode Space Marine armor even and take out chunks of units. And as they float around, because they have such a powerful psychic presence, they of course are natural Synapse creatures as well, as that'll go out and radiate to the nearby creatures. So they're good for that reason. Not only are they a good Synapse creature, but they have that auxiliary purpose of providing the extra psychic support. And then we have the Tervagons. The Tervagons are creatures that they roam the ships of the Hive fleet while everything else is dormant and they're traveling. The Tervagons typically aren't. So they're kind of a sentinel. And they, inside their huge sacks that are hanging down in front of them, they're full of termagants ready to be birthed at a moment's notice. And when I say ready to be birthed, I mean like they come out charging, they come out shooting, and they come out ready to fend off whatever it is. So termagants will roam Hive ships, and if there are intruders that are found, they of course will disgorge the termagants. And the termagants then of course need to be Synapse creatures, unlike Tyrannifexes or Carnifexes, which are similar size. Because not only do they need to exert their influence on those termagants, because sometimes they're the only ones around to do so, but they need to be able to contact the other creatures that are dormant and wake them up so that they can respond to the threat on a Hive fleet, on a ship in the Hive fleet. Of course, we can find termagants wading into combat as well once we do planetfall and they're doing their invasion, because it's quite handy to have something nearby that can disgorge and spawn new troops and also control them. So the Tervagon is especially adapted to working with those termagants. It has a special synaptic connection to them. So special that if a Tervagon dies, nearby termagants experience a synaptic backlash and it can actually kill them. And it usually does kill large groups of termagants when one of them goes down. So they are, in a sense, they have the early warning ability, but they also have the disadvantage to the fleet of being so key that when you take one of them out, it really affects the organisms around them. But the Hive fleet obviously has seen them as more of an advantage than a disadvantage, and hasn't somehow dimmed their ability to really be linked to termagants in order to get rid of that disadvantage. And then we got the Trigon Prime. Somehow the large creature that has able to burrow through, has also developed the synaptic ability. This is a huge advantage to the Hive fleet because it allows it to exert its will in the front lines, because Trigons and Molochs and Raveners are creatures that are all able to burrow right through the Earth's crust and able to get right under the enemy lines and then pop right out. But the problem with that is that usually means that they're far away from the Hive Tyrants and the Warriors. Even the Shrikes and the Flying Hive Tyrants won't necessarily be right where they are, because they might fly forward and hit the front lines, but the Trigons and Molochs and the Raveners pop out behind the enemy lines and start wreaking havoc there. But thankfully, the Hive fleet, or maybe not thankfully to the food for the Hive fleet, but the Hive fleet has developed the ability to have Trigons be developed even further, and they become even more colossal creatures called Trigon Primes, and they're able to exert their influence nearby and draw organisms with them as they go through. And this actually, it works to their advantage because the tunnels they create can then be used by smaller organisms like termagants and hormagaunts to follow them through. So that helps that there's a Synapse creature on the other end to then exert the will of the Hive Mind on them. And then we have what's called a dominatrix, and this is kind of a brood mother of sorts, or some sort of queen, however you want to look at it. These are huge creatures. We don't really see them that often. They were more in the Vanguard fleets, so it's not known if they've been, if something new's been developed and they've been discarded, but they were even more linked to the Hive Mind than Hive Tyrants, and they're just huge colossal creatures that dwarf super heavies such as Bane Blades, and they had an arsenal to match it, an armor to match it, and they could really exert their will on the local Tyranid models. But we don't really see those very often anymore. We're not quite sure why. And then we have this really interesting thing called the Brood Mind. And this is mainly established by a group of gene stealers. Now in our first episode, we talked about the gene stealer, or sorry, the second episode that was in the vault, we talked about the gene stealer cult and the relationship it had with a Hive fleet invasion. Well, the reason that they're able to operate this way is because they're given their own brood telepathy. In other words, as the gene stealers work together, they create their own miniature hive mind that is not linked to the overall hive mind. And see, this is giving more support to the theory that there is no one psychic creature that controls all the Tyranids, but instead it actually is a group consciousness. And the reason that you can say that is because when you get a group of gene stealers together, they form their own hive mind. So it does show that it's not just one gigantic hive mind either, but more one gigantic species that has the ability to link together, hence why we see different hive fleets. Perhaps, this is all conjecture, of course. But as the brood telepathy of the gene stealers works together to ensnare their victims and increase that brood, it serves a dual purpose of course, becoming a beacon to a nearby hive fleet, which will come in. And this also gives them this interesting instinctive drive to stay away from hive fleets, which of course naturally spreads out the gene stealers to new worlds to seed and prepare for the Tyranids. So it's a very interesting symbiotic relationship, which I talked more about in episode 2, which is available in the vault. And of course, leading these gene stealer cults and this brood telepathy and brood mind will be a very powerful gene stealer called a brood lord, commonly referred to as the patriarch of the gene stealer cult. So that is an overview of what the synapse is, the hive mind is, and how it all interlinks together. It's totally alien to the way we think. We're so used to thinking individually, and we try to exert our wills on each other. We try to exert our opinions on each other. We enact laws so we can work as a society together, but in the end, individually, we can act against those things, and we have that free will. Whereas with the Tyranids, they individually seem that they have some sort of control over what they do, but in the end, they have no free will, and they all bow to the might of the hive mind, the group consciousness. I hope that you enjoyed this. The next video, which is in the vault at the link below, I am going to be talking about the tactics behind Synapse and how you can build lists properly so that you have the proper synaptic control over your armies and how to best use it and the ways to get around it and things to make it more powerful, and which units you should and maybe should not bring as well into your army list if you're trying to play competitively. So go ahead and click on the link below for that. Of course, it's in the vault. If you're not a vault member, you can still click the link and get a free 7-day trial. Try it out, get instant access to this next video, plus all the thousands of other battle reports and painting tutorials and all the other videos that we have in the vault as well. And it helps support us so that we can make more of these videos. Thanks for watching. This is Matthew from MiniWarGaming. Happy wargaming.